Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight begins our peaceful journey through the lives of England's most fascinating queens, a 6-part series that will softly explore the remarkable women who shaped the Tudor dynasty and beyond, from the 1500s to the modern era. In Part 4, we'll gently discover the stories of Henry VIII's final 3 wives, from Anne of Cleves' diplomatic marriage and graceful survival, to Catherine Howard's tragic youth and ultimate downfall, and finally Catherine Parr's scholarly devotion and quiet influence, all while the Tudor court transformed around powerful female figures who each left their unique mark on England. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about which queen's story resonated most, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from the 1500s lull you into restful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Anna, later known as Anne of Cleves, the 4th Queen Consort of England, entered the world most likely at Swan Castle in the vicinity of Dusseldorf, Germany, while historians traditionally place her birth on September 21st or 22nd, 1515. Recent scholarly work suggests a date between late June and early July may be more accurate. Her father was Johann I, Duke of Cleves, and her mother was Maria, Duchess of Jülichburg. When Anna's parents first wed, each ruled their own distinct territory. Though Johann eventually inherited ducal titles connected to his wife's domains, it was Maria who truly wielded governmental authority. Renaissance Germany offered fascinating opportunities for noblewomen's political leadership, with German duchies, principalities and city-states often governed by women. When male heirs were absent, German nobles typically preferred investing power in their daughters rather than distant male relatives. Anna's mother exemplified such an heiress. As her father's sole child, she became Duchess and Regent of Jülichburg upon his death. Maria ruled her territories as regent, while her husband Johann held ceremonial titles associated with his wife's duchy. Within 15 years of marriage, Anna's parents had successfully united their separate ducal administrations. Until that time, Johann and Maria maintained relatively independent lives for a married couple with young children. The Duke and Duchess of Cleves Jülichburg have 4 children. Their eldest, Sibylla, born in 1512, was 3 years Anna's senior, and the sisters maintained a strong relationship throughout their lives, continuing correspondence even after Anna departed for England. 2 younger siblings followed Anna in quick succession. Their only son, Wilhelm, arrived in 1560, followed by youngest daughter Amalia in 1517. Since Johann and Maria each governed different regional entities, they often maintained separate households during their marriage's early years. Anna spent most of her childhood at Burg Castle in Solingen alongside her mother and sister. Her education was remarkably progressive for Renaissance. Anna, Sibylla, and Amalia likely received instruction in regional property laws, taxation custom, large-scale financial management, and dispute arbitration between officials and civilians. Additionally, they learned estate management, including supervision of extensive farming and livestock operations. Anna descended from many generations of influential women who played vital governing roles in their communities. Because German noblewomen frequently exercised complete authority in the absence of male figures, Anna and her sisters received education that their English contemporaries would have considered quite masculine in nature. This shouldn't suggest that the 3 young duchesses neglected domestic responsibilities, which were expected of all early modern European women, from duchess to peasant. The daughters of the Duchess of Cleves Jülichburg learned household management, which for German noblewomen appeared much more hands-on than for English, French, or Spanish aristocrats. While elite women from England, Spain, or France rarely performed domestic tasks personally, German noblewomen frequently learned cooking, sewing, and clothing production. This strikes observers as eminently practical, since an estate's mistress could hardly manage property effectively without understanding the work involved. German noblewomen's productivity and skill in daily activities earned praise, as they were viewed as equal partners in their marriages and families. Indeed, a noblewoman's household economy sometimes yielded greater profits than her lands when managed shrewdly. Some aristocratic European women had opportunities for scholarly and intellectual education, but this probably wasn't Anna's case. She may have learned dancing, and her parents' ducal courts regularly supported talented musicians, but Anna didn't learn singing or musical instrument. She could read and write, but only in German, with no evidence of studying standard Renaissance academics like rhetoric, history, or philosophy. Most of her early education centered on practical skills, literacy, estate and household management, sewing, and embroidery. This wasn't necessarily due to Anna's gender. Her father Johann, a friend and correspondent of renowned Dutch philosopher Erasmus, was quite scholarly and didn't seem to discourage intellectualism in his daughters. Anna's older sister Sibylla became quite the fierce intellectual, a friend and correspondent of Martin Luther and a passionate Lutheran reformer. However, Sibylla's religious and political leanings were likely influenced more by her husband than her parents. Sibylla married Prince Johann Friedrich, Elector of Saxony, at age 15, the fiercely Protestant friend and supporter of Martin Luther, and a constant irritant to Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Anna's religious sensibilities remain largely unknown, and the religious diversity within her family and Germany during her upbringing makes determining her actual beliefs even more difficult. Anna's mother was described as a devout Catholic who never wavered from her faith. Anna's father, Duke Johann, also remained Catholic through the early Reformation, but openly demonstrated Lutheran sympathies and religious tolerance. Anna's younger siblings, Wilhelm and Amelia, would spend significant portions of their adult lives disagreeing over religion. Wilhelm consistently maintained cordial relations with the Protestant Schmalkaldic League, led by his brother-in-law, the Elector of Saxony. Wilhelm himself, however, remained Catholic throughout his life and insisted his sons be raised Catholic as well. The Lutheran sympathies of both Wilhelm and his father might be explained partly by their distrust of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, with whom both engaged in a prolonged land dispute over Gelderland. Anna's youngest sister, Amalia, was as passionately committed to Protestant reform as eldest sister Sibylla. Amalia never married or had children, and she apparently spent her later years caring for and educating her young nieces. One story describes Wilhelm's anger at his sister for teaching the girls Protestant principle. This conflict reportedly enraged him enough to chase and threaten Amalia with a hammer. An incident ended only when her servant slammed and locked the door in the Duke's face. Considering all this, determining Anna's personal beliefs is impossible, but exposure to such religious diversity in early life may have given her broad perspective and spiritual flexibility. It may also have taught her the value of both conformity and tolerance, depending on what circumstances required. When Anna was 11, she was betrothed to the Duke of Lorraine's son, an informal arrangement nullified 7 years later. One biographer noted that Anna didn't seem particularly distressed by her betrothal's cancellation, despite being 18, 3 years older than Sibylla had been at marriage. Anna's attachment to her mother and family household seemed genuinely content. At the court of Cleves-Julichburg, mourning activities were strictly divided by gender. Noble men attended political and estate matters, while noble women and daughters focused on domestic tasks. Men and women then gathered in afternoon formal socializing. Anna's typical day might involve embroidering and clothing production with her mother, younger sister, and other women in the Frauenzimmer, or women's chamber, during mornings. Young court women were only permitted to meet and socialize with men during afternoon gatherings or at sumptuous 9-course dinners, served nightly to as many as 300 guests. Anna's family enjoyed entertaining themselves and the court with music and theatrical performances. Hunting was another favourite family pastime, and Anna was reportedly an excellent equestrian who loved joining the hunt. In 1538, when Anna was 23, her father died, an event that drew her even closer to her. Yet her time in Germany was growing short, and both her future and her family's future now rested with her younger brother Wilhelm. It was in 1538 when Thomas Cromwell first approached the young, new Duke of Cleves on behalf of Henry VIII, who was determined to marry again. Convinced by Cromwell that Cleves' support would help Henry defend against Emperor Charles V without relying on the equally unpredictable King of France, Henry sought to conclude marriage negotiations quickly. Duke Wilhelm had resisted for months Henry's request to allow portraits of Anna and Amalia, and for Henry's ambassadors to see the Duke's sisters personally. Frustrated, the English ambassadors had only been permitted to see them in voluminous German court dress with veiled faces. To expedite the marriage treaty, Henry finally offered to waive Anna's dowry and offered the Duke a generous payment of 100,000 francs instead. Wilhelm promptly accepted Henry's offer, writing that his sister eagerly anticipated her wedding. In November 1539, Anna departed Germany for her overland journey to the multitude of nobles, attendants, and servants travelling with her made it a lengthy journey, further delayed by poor Channel weather following their Calais arrival, preventing Anna from sailing to England for several days. She was greeted and entertained there, meanwhile, by the Earl of Southampton and Duke of Suffolk. From her English landing, Anna felt somewhat less homesick than after bidding farewell to home and family. She was received with kindness, enthusiasm, and admiration everywhere she and her escort stopped, with crowds of ordinary people gathering to see her and wish her well. All of Henry's nobles and ambassadors wrote to him of her cheerful friendliness and assured him she was as lovely as Hans Holbein's portrait suggested. This portrait depicts Anne in Dutch-style dress, modest and serene with widely spaced, heavy-lidded eyes and shapely lips. Sources describe her as tall, slender, and blue-eyed with light blonde hair. For reasons still not entirely clear, Henry was less than pleased with his bride-to-be. Hearing that his future wife was delayed on the road, and that his wedding couldn't occur by Christmas, Henry resolved to wait patiently until January 6th, the chosen postponement date. Restlessness and eagerness to meet her proved too much for Henry, however, and on New Year's Day 1540, he set off to meet her earlier than planned, bearing a New Year's gift. Henry staged his entrance theatrically, in disguise. He approached Anna without hesitation, kneeling to kiss her hand. Unfortunately, Anna was startled by this behaviour, not only for modesty's sake, but because she had no idea who Henry was. She couldn't have understood the mistake she made. Unfamiliar with English culture, and unable to understand that Henry expected her to recognise her true love through his disguise, Henry was humiliated that Anna appeared repulsed and tried to ignore him. He abruptly left the room and, throwing off his disguise, returned in a more kingly-looking royal purple coat. Deeply embarrassed, Anna bowed deeply before him, and Henry kissed her briefly before politely extracting himself from the situation. But the king was vocal about his dissatisfaction as soon as he was out of his new fiancé's earshot. He was so upset that he forgot to give Anna the New Year's gift, a jewelled sable fur. Henry returned to Greenwich furious. He complained to courtiers who had previously reported Anna as pleasing, just as Henry had believed when seeing Holbein's portrait. He complained bitterly to Thomas Cromwell that his intended was nothing as fair as reported. "I like her not," he declared emphatically, and demanded what could be done to prevent the marriage. Unfortunately, since there seemed no way to nullify his engagement without risking Cleves' anger and enmity, Henry proceeded with the wedding as planned on January 6, 1540. He would spend his brief 6-month marriage to Anna attempting to find divorce. The morning after their wedding night, Thomas Cromwell anxiously asked Henry how he liked the Queen. Henry replied that he liked her even less than before. He declared he hadn't consummated his marriage because Anna repulsed him. He claimed to doubt her virginity because of the looseness of her belly and breast. He also consulted his doctors, confiding that he believed himself sexually capable, just not with Anna, and defended himself from impotence implications by claiming he continued experiencing nocturnal emissions. What Henry appears to have been doing is establishing grounds for annulment based on non-consummation. Indeed, within weeks, he informed his Privy Council that there must be some impediment to his marriage because God would not permit him to consummate it. He requested that Anna's previous betrothal to the Duke of Lorraine's son be re-examined to determine whether the contract had been. Henry's councillors knew exactly what he expected. By February 1540, Anna understood something was terribly wrong in her marriage. She tried hard to make herself agreeable to the king, and Henry continued dining regularly with Anna and sharing her bed nightly, so she'd have no cause for complaint. It's unclear how much she knew about marital relations for her wedding night, but one account of a conversation between Anna and her ladies suggests her ignorance of intimate matters might have been nearly complete. Her ladies-in-waiting, undoubtedly fishing for information, indicated to Anna that she'd soon be with child. The Queen replied, "I know very well that I am not. How is it possible for you to know that, lying every night with the king?" They inquired. Anna again insisted she wasn't with child. "I think your grace is still a maid," said Lady Rochford, George Boleyn's widow. "How can I be a maid," asked Anne, "and sleep with the king every night? There must be more than this." Lady Rochford replied, treading dangerous ground. But instead of taking offence at Lady Rochford's impertinent suggestion, Anna patiently explained, "When the king comes to bed, he kisses me and takes me by the hand, saying, 'Good night, sweet,' and in the morning he kisses me and bids me, 'Farewell, my darling.' Is this not enough?" The Countess of Rutland tried making the Queen understand. "Madam, there must be more than this, or it will be long before we have a Duke of York," meaning a second son for Henry. "No," Anna reportedly replied. "I am content with this, for I know no." This fascinating and puzzling exchange's meaning remains unclear. Anna seems to imply she wasn't aware anything was wrong in her marriage, but she may have been feigning ignorance for her own reputation's sake, or Henry's. We don't ultimately know whether Henry and Anna consummate. Henry may have spoken truthfully, and his disappointment in finally meeting his new queen was so great he couldn't mentally prepare for intimacy. However, Henry was also 48 at the time of his fourth marriage. He was already twice Anna's age, running to fat, and the terrible sore on his leg, which would eventually kill him, continued to swell, fester, and smell periodically. Considering Henry's health state, plus his obvious disappointment with his new wife, Henry may have been experiencing impotence and reacting poorly by blaming his brother. Whatever the truth between them, poor Anna was ill-prepared to address it. She had arrived in England, married Henry, and been proclaimed queen all within weeks, without yet learning much English. This not only made staying informed about events around her difficult, but prevented her from expressing herself to those who might have helped. Moreover, being so new at Henry's court, she couldn't have known whom to trust. Sadly for Anna, Henry moved on quickly, and by springtime, the king could be seen crossing the Thames regularly in evenings, headed for Lambeth Palace, and his latest mistress, 16-year-old Catherine Howard, the Duke of Norfolk's niece. There was grumbling and judgment heard among London's people regarding Henry's infidelity to his queen, reminiscent of sympathies similarly expressed for Anne Boleyn when Henry's affair with Jane Seymour became known. On June 24, 1540, Henry sent Anna away from court to Richmond Palace, ostensibly for her health and safety from the plague. However, Henry's feelings about illness were such that he surely would have also departed the city if risks had been real. Less than 3 weeks later, Henry obtained annulment of his marriage based on its non-consummation and Anna's pre-contract to marry the Duke of Lorraine's son. The Queen was presented with Henry's divorce grounds on July 10th. Should she consent, Henry assured her she'd be treated kindly and provided for. Anna was utterly humiliated and wept when Henry's divorce request was read. She initially refused to heed what was asked and quickly summoned the Cleves ambassador. Within a day, however, Anna had calmed. She'd had time to think, and no doubt both embarrassment and fear had warred in her mind. Should she accept, she'd be disgraced and discarded. But should she refuse, she couldn't say whether the dangerously unpredictable Henry wouldn't harm her. To her credit, Anna was quick and resolute in her decision, following through admirably. Anna accepted her divorce from Henry with grace, dignity, and friendliness, saying she hoped she'd still occasionally have the pleasure of his company. Henry was shocked. Anna had been fearful and difficult during the weeks since he'd taken Catherine Howard as mistress, and he'd expected her to resist, to threaten him with her brother's outrage and vengeance. Because she readily gave Henry what he wanted, he was generous with her. On July 12th, Henry wrote informing Anna she was free to return home. However, should she decide remaining in England, she'd receive an annual income of £4,000 and the estates of Richmond, Bletchingley, and Hever Castle. Despite Henry's earlier wedding night claim, he formally affirmed that Anna was still a virgin and said she might remarry if she wished. Finally, he hoped she'd be pleased to think of herself thenceforth as the king's most beloved sister, and assured her she'd always be welcome at court and given precedence over all women in England except the Queen and Henry's daughters. Apparently, Anne found this generous indeed and readily accepted. In fact, she went further by assuring Henry he was welcome to view any correspondence she might have with her Cleves family before it would. It's possible Anna might have chosen staying in England out of fear. One puzzling account claims the German princess implied her brother might harm her if she returned home dishonoured. Her arrangements with Henry concluded, Anna promptly wrote her brother informing him of the accord she and Henry had reached, assuring him she was happy and content to live out her life in England. The woman who had spent most of her life in seemingly quiet and obedient submission, first in her mother's shadow, then in a king's shadow, was now a free and independent woman of means. Like the strong female rulers who were her ancestors, Anna had found herself controlling her own life. Moreover, she had neither husband nor master to tell her what. Anna lived her last 14 years quite happily and comfortably on her English estates, described by one chronicler as an eminently kind and generous mistress to everyone who served her. She earned Henry's trust and gratitude not only for conforming to his will, but for her continued devotion to his children, for whom she tried to be a warm and loving stepmother. Indeed, Anna maintained and strengthened her relationships with Henry's children in the years following her divorce. Even Lady Mary came to care for and appreciate her former stepmother in subsequent years, despite what she perceived as major religious differences between them. Actually, it's still unclear whether her religion's denomination made any difference to Anna at all. She'd embraced Henry's Anglican faith without protest upon arriving in England. During Edward VI and Mary's short and turbulent reigns, Anna willingly declared religious obedience. When 9-year-old Edward took the throne, she affirmed herself Protestant. When Mary succeeded him as queen, Anna didn't hesitate, declaring herself Roman Catholic. Perhaps she was being pragmatic, but perhaps the religious and denominational variability she'd been exposed to in Germany and within her own family made her eminently more spiritually flexible. Anne of Cleves remained highly favoured by Henry's children following his 1547 death. She was often invited to court during Edward and Mary's reigns, and she walked behind her former stepdaughter Elizabeth's coronation procession. She got along adequately with Henry's last 2 wives, although one cryptic comment she made during Henry's wedding to Catherine Parr gave imperial ambassador chappies the impression she resented Catherine. Madame Parr is taking a great burden unto herself, Anna reportedly remarked during the ceremony. Chappies interpreted this as catty jealousy from a woman who Henry had refused to remarry after Catherine Howard's exile. However, it was her brother Wilhelm who had suggested Henry take his sister back, not Anna. It's possible Anna meant something entirely different when speaking of Madame Parr's great burden. Perhaps she was thinking of Henry's most recently discarded wife, the disgraced teenaged Queen Catherine Howard, executed for treason at only 19. Anna remained in royal favour until Wyatt's rebellion of 1554. Because Queen Mary, I suspected Anna might have aided the rebels' cause due to Protestant sympathies and love for Sister Elizabeth, she was no longer invited to court and confined to her estates. By spring 1557, Anna's health had begun declining. She grew thinner and paler and lost her appetite, and historians believe she may have been suffering final stages of some cancer. Anne of Cleves died on July 16, 1557, at age 41 or 42. Despite her marriage's short duration, she had come to be much loved and admired by the English people and Henry's own family. She was honoured with Westminster Abbey burial by Queen Mary I, who chose Anna's burial site herself and ordered that a vigil be kept for her each night until her August 4th funeral. Anne of Cleves' grave can be found today on the Abbey's high altar south side. A plain stone slightly above eye level featuring her coat of arms reading simply, Anne of Cleves, Queen of England. Born 1550, died 1557. Despite the pain and embarrassment her short, unsuccessful marriage must have caused, Anna, to use her German name, arguably fared better than any of her 5 counterparts when her marriage ended. Of all Henry's wives, Anna's origins tend to be least well known, since from the English perspective, their marriage was little more than a brief interruption in Henry's reign's larger context. But upon close consideration of what little is known, both Anna herself and her story strike observers as highly unique and interesting. Catherine, later known as Catherine Howard, the 5th Queen Consort of England, was born a noblewoman sometime between 1518 and 1527. Her father was Edmund Howard, the Duke of Norfolk's 3rd son, and her mother was Jocasta Culpeper, also frequently called Joyce in period documents. Joyce Culpeper gave birth to 11 children who survived to adulthood, an incredible occurrence in 16th century. Culpeper had 5 children with her first husband, Sir Ralph Lee, and 6 more with her second husband, Edmund Howard, of whom Catherine was second youngest. Lord Edmund lived with his wife and children in a stately but modestly appointed. Their home was provided by Lord Edmund's father and located on Church Street in Lambeth Parish, Surrey. Edmund often lamented his aristocratic birth for the financial pressure it brought. He was one of the Duke's younger sons, and his modest inheritance, he claimed, could never support him, much less his wife and children, in the style expected of the Howards. Paid work of any kind was considered vulgar for Tudor noblemen. Lacking other income, Edmund served as a local justice at Lambeth and was later made Comptroller of Calais, but nonetheless found himself continuously in debt. He was also terrible at managing the few financial resources he had and spent most of his adult life borrowing money from friends, ducking creditors, and avoiding the anger of 3 successive wives. Catherine Howard's birth date is uncertain and highly debated, with some historians dating it as early as 1518 and others as late as 1527. However, a mid-range date seems more likely given documentary evidence. Joyce's former father-in-law's will, Sir John Lee, probated in 1524, mentions Catherine's older siblings Henry, Charles, George and Margaret, but not Catherine herself or her younger sister Isabel, presumably because they were either too young to be considered or not yet born. However, Catherine's maternal grandmother's 1527 will mentions both Catherine and therefore a birth date somewhere between 1522 and 1525 seems more plausible. If we accept this estimate, then Catherine was at most no more than 6 when her mother died in 1520. By the following year, Edmund Howard had embarked on the first of 2 subsequent marriages, and according to custom, some or perhaps all of his children by his previous wife were placed in Howard relatives' homes. This wasn't as harsh as it may appear today. The early modern English practice of putting out young children was frequently undertaken, even if both parents were still living and readily able to care for them. Many children, perhaps a near majority between ages 6 and 12, might be sent to households outside their immediate family to complete training or education, or to begin service. This practice was considered necessary for working-class children because of a child's labour's economic value to their families. But gentry and noble families put out their children just as some historians believe they did so to keep children from being spoiled by parents who might indulge them, rather than impose much-needed structure and discipline. Even King Henry's son, Prince Edward, was taken from his governess, nurses, and sisters at age 6, and given into a governor and tutor's care to complete his education to be king. As a result of this widespread putting out practice, Catherine Howard probably didn't get opportunities to develop very close relationships with all her many siblings during childhood, although at least one brother did initially accompany her to her new house. Catherine welcomed opportunities to nurture her sibling relationships later, however, when she became queen. Sometime between 1529 and 1531, when she was probably between 6 and 8, Catherine was sent to live in Edmund's widowed stepmother's household, Agnes Howard, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Catherine spent roughly the next decade living either at Chesworth, the Duchess's country estate at Horsham in Sussex, or at Norfolk House in Lambeth. The Dowager Duchess was probably the most prominent noblewoman in England. Virtually no woman besides the Queen herself or Henry's daughters could claim precedence over her. So this was a very advantageous household for any child to be placed in, one where the child was certain to get an excellent education and meet the right people. The Duchess indeed had many wards. There could have been, at any time, as many as a dozen children of varying age and status living in her household, so Catherine would hardly have been lonely. She would have spent most of her time in what was known as the Maiden's Chamber, which was essentially a girl's dormitory, home to both wards and servants. At first glance, such arrangements might suggest there was little or no pride of place difference in treatment between more aristocratic children and those of humbler origins under the Duchess's care. But the reality was probably more nuanced. Catherine might have played, laughed, argued, fought, eaten her meals, and shared her bed with any number of children from diverse socio-economic backgrounds. But at the same time, the Howard name, her rank, and heritage likely gave her decided superiority, one which makes the observer doubt that any fellow wards could have prevented her from having her own way when she wanted it. Apparently, Catherine and her brother George were the only wards permitted to dine at table with the and Catherine's status probably gave her authority to control the Maiden's Chamber activities and arrangements to a certain extent. Nonetheless, the boarding school-style atmosphere probably did much to shape her personality. Few truly specific details are known about Catherine's childhood, but many historians believe she experienced rather lax and unstructured upbringing for a noble ward in an aristocratic household. Documentary evidence suggests the Dowager Duchess neglected her duty as caregiver and supervisor, and as a result, her wards often ran rather wild. To be fair to the Duchess, who was in her 70s and headed a household totaling 100 people, there was little she could do to police everyone residing under her roofs. Catherine's contemporaries remarked on the notable lack of reserve and dignity in her behaviour, but many of the same critics were willing to concede she also had a kind demeanour, which was immediately warm and engaging. Perhaps her life in the Duchess's household among children from many different backgrounds had made her less pretentious. Unlike many Tudor aristocrats, Catherine Howard less often displayed the self-important haughtiness for which the nobility were renowned. Still, her flightiness and lack of reserve would hardly have endeared her to those who expected a noble lady, or more importantly, a queen, to act accordingly. And unfortunately, the lack of supervision and discipline in Agnes Howard's household was to have catastrophic and tragic consequences for Catherine later on. Catherine received education similar to other noble women of the Tudor era. Conduct and etiquette would have been her first and most important lessons. As a Howard, who would undoubtedly have to appear at court one day, Catherine would have learned how to properly walk, stand, sit, and curtsy, as well as how to address and serve individuals according to their rank. She would have learned table etiquette rules and how to make polite conversation, but also likely the virtues of silence and obedience in women. Catherine probably received her most extensive training in dance and was described by many contemporaries as a fine and graceful dancer. She received music lessons in the Duchess's household, reportedly learning to play the virginal, a small version of the harpsichord piano, as well as the lute. However, it seems she didn't maintain her music interest. Between ages 10 and 12, Catherine learned to read and write. She seems to have not received any academic training beyond basic literacy, but this wasn't unusual in the 15th century. In fact, the Tudor princesses were some of the first early modern English women as carefully educated as their male counterparts, learning history, philosophy, geography, and multiple languages as part of their education. When Catherine Howard was between 12 and 14, she began taking music lessons from a teacher named Henry VIII, a man at least 10 years her senior, who soon began making romantic and sexual overtures toward his adolescent. Scholars are divided on their relationship's nature, with some characterizing it as sexual abuse. Many modern observers would readily agree, considering Catherine's extreme youth at the ship's time. But Catherine was also at the threshold of sexual awakening, and in the Tudor era, fairly close to marriage eligibility age, and may have willingly responded to Manox's advances, which from a modern perspective is commonly viewed as exploitative. It's widely agreed that Catherine and Manox had a relationship lasting several months, but their relationship didn't cross the final physical boundary. Later, Catherine was probably most likely glad it hadn't. According to a housemaid in service to the Duchess named Mary Lassell, Manox admitted that while he had no honourable intentions toward Catherine, he nonetheless boasted he would have her maidenhead. Reportedly furious when she learned this, Catherine broke off her relationship with Manox, who soon resigned his position as her music teacher. Our understanding of history is often less heavily influenced by the events themselves than by the scholars who interpret them. Historians have traditionally denigrated Catherine as a morally loose and promiscuous young woman, but more recent historians have shown different attitudes. Most no longer view sexual curiosity or experimentation as inherently wicked or destructive, and feminist interpretations of Henry's ill-fated fifth wife have begun challenging the traditional indictment of her character based on her sexuality. More than one recent biographer has highlighted the overtones of abuse and manipulation by a much older adult man in a position of trust, and no more than a year after her break with Manox, another young man named Francis Derham came to join the household in service to the Dowager. Francis Derham began his employment as secretary to the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk in 1538. He was probably the same age as Manox, in his mid-20s, while Catherine was probably 14 or 15. The two formed an attachment that continued for at least several months, but may have lasted near. Derham called Catherine wife, and she called him husband. They gave each other small gifts and love tokens. He gave her gifts of velvet and silk flowers, while she embroidered an armband and a friar's knot for it. Francis also entrusted his money to Catherine when he went away on business. The argument for Catherine's control over the maiden's chamber is strong, because it seems impossible she could have entertained Derham there as many times as she probably did, for as many months as she did, without the Duchess finding out. And unlike her relationship with Manox, it seems fairly certain that Catherine's relationship with Francis Derham was fully consummated. To any casual observer during the Tudor period, it would appear Catherine and Francis would eventually marry. In fact, in medieval and early modern Europe, any two unmarried people who had declared their intention to wed one another and who had already slept together were considered pre-contracted, which was as good as married in the Church's eyes. Unfortunately for the young couple, the Duchess eventually found out about their affair. Apparently acting out of jealousy, the rejected Henry Manox wrote the Duchess an anonymous letter exposing Francis and Catherine's relationship and slipped it onto her church. Furious, the Duchess was quick to send Derham away. He left for Ireland, promising Catherine he would eventually return. But by the time he did, Catherine would already be married, and would have risen to become Queen Consort of England. It's impossible to know if, and how deeply, she mourned her parting from Francis Derham. In any event, as the Duke of Norfolk's niece, she probably wouldn't have been permitted to marry him, or indeed to choose her own husband at all. Derham was better born than Henry Manox, but likely still not good enough for a duke's niece. In autumn 1539, King Henry VIII was preparing to wed his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. Anxious to add a Howard lady-in-waiting to the new Queen's chamber, the Duke of Norfolk decided his young niece Catherine should be sent to live and serve in Queen Anne's new household. Catherine's father, Edmund Howard, had died just a few months previously, and her uncle, the Duke, promptly took advantage of his new ability to control his niece's destiny. Soon after Catherine's arrival at court, she very likely met Thomas Culpeper, one of the king's personal servants, a member of the Privy Chamber, and a distant cousin of hers on her mother's side. It's not clear if their acquaintance predates Catherine's court arrival, but some historians believe an affection may have grown between them well before Henry first noticed her. Catherine's apparent affection for Culpeper would eventually prove disastrous for both of them. By January 1540, it was abundantly clear that the freshly remarried Henry VIII was already seeking to divorce his latest wife. It's not known exactly when Henry first noticed Catherine, but by March, there was already talk of how frequently the king could be seen crossing the Thames toward Lambeth to visit Norfolk House, and of the young lady whom many in the capital believe was already his mistress. Anne of Cleves' fall from favour had left a power vacuum at court. Religious conservatives like the Howards, anxious to dispense with this new queen who was assumed to be Protestant, saw an opportunity. Catherine was very young, probably no more than 17, and not terribly well educated. As a result, she was a less than ideal choice for those seeking a woman to help manage the king. She was, however, the woman of the moment, and for Henry, that seemed to be. The king was nearing 50, and his fascination with the teenaged lady-in-waiting speaks eloquently of a midlife crisis. Henry was clearly disappointed after his first meeting with Anne of Cleves, claiming her appearance was unsatisfactory. Anne had also unintentionally and publicly embarrassed Henry during their first meeting by not recognizing and thus behaving coldly toward him. This awkward encounter likely contributed to Henry's initial dislike of her. Some historians believe advancing impotence related to the king's age and health problems may also have played a significant role in Henry's failure to consummate his fourth marriage. Henry certainly protested and assured multiple parties of his potency and virility in the weeks following his wedding night, almost defensively, it might seem to some observers. Winning the favour of a beautiful young girl like Catherine would doubtless have helped Henry feel as if he was regaining some of his lost youth. Evidence suggests Catherine Howard was the miniature painted by Hans Holbein, the younger between 1540 and 1542, is one of the few portraits which most historians can agree most likely depicts Catherine, although a few have pointed out that the early date range of 1540 indicates the sitter in the portrait might well be Anne of Cleves. Anne, however, was thought to have had blonde hair, not auburn like the subject in the miniature portrait. Nonetheless, the sitter's identity as queen may reasonably be inferred from the jewels she wears. Henry is known to have gifted the same royal jewels repeatedly to his successive wives, and the jewels worn by the subject in the miniature portrait appear nearly identical to those worn by Jane Seymour in her Holbein portrait. In the miniature portrait, the subject assumed to be Catherine Howard has auburn red hair, visible under her jewelled coif, and her brown eyes gaze softly and knowingly at the viewer, as if she's privy to some secret which the observer is not. She has a full prominent nose and an oval face with shapely lips and eyebrows. What can be seen of her figure appears slim, but there's the slight suggestion of a double chin in the portrait, which might suggest she had some curviness to her figure. Another Holbein sketch, roughly dated from 1540 to 1545, known as Portrait of a Young Woman, is also believed by several scholars to depict Catherine. In this sketch, The subject appears even younger than the one in the mini, with similar but somewhat more exaggeratedly delicate features. Unfortunately, since Catherine died in disgrace with her husband, keen to forget her, she hasn't been well enough memorialized for us to be sure which of the numerous Tudor portraits of unnamed ladies actually depict Catherine for certain. Contemporary observers described her as petite, pretty, charming, and high-spirited. Throughout spring 1540, Henry showered Catherine with gifts, expensive clothing, jewellery, and even lands. Aware of the king's interest and confident in Henry's ability to eventually dispense with his current wife, the Duke and Dowager Duchess of Norfolk carefully coached Catherine regarding how she should behave toward Henry and how best to please him. Some of Catherine's biographers believe she and Henry consummated their relationship sometime in May, when the king began to noticeably escalate efforts to divorce Anne of Cleves. Perhaps the renewed urgency stemmed from a belief that Catherine might already be pregnant. On July 28, 1540, only 6 months after his wedding to Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII married Catherine Howard at Oatlands Palace near Weybridge in Surrey. Henry's new queen consort settled into her new role fairly well initially. She adopted a badge featuring a crown, rose, and the motto, Non auter voluntas que la sienne, or no other will than his, a sentiment which could not have failed to please Henry. The king was clearly besotted with his young bride. His courtiers and ambassadors remarked pointedly on Henry's constant and openly affectionate behaviour towards Catherine. Even in public, he couldn't keep his hands off her and continued to spoil her regularly with lavish gifts and honours. Henry took his bride on a 6-month honeymoon throughout southern England, going from one royal palace to another, hunting, feasting, being entertained, and of course, doing what the newly married often do. Because of Henry's advancing age and declining health, and because he had no more children after Jane Seymour's death, some historians have speculated he was unable to consummate any of his life, and that perhaps his last 2 spouses, Catherine Parr in particular, were Henry's nurses rather than his wives. Other historians disagree strongly, however, pointing out that intimate relations between 16th century married couples were heartily encouraged and considered normal and healthy for couples at any age. Moreover, men of mature years regularly married girls as young as Catherine Howard during the Tudor period, and many of these unions produced children. There is evidence to suggest Henry anticipated on several occasions throughout his marriage to Catherine that she might be pregnant. The king seemed to have developed a policy, beginning with his 3rd marriage, not to consider having a coronation for a queen until she had produced an heir. But shortly before their 1541 progress to northern England, tentative preparations seem to have been underway for a potential queen's coronation at York, one which never materialized since Catherine wasn't found to be pregnant after all. Some scholars speculate she may have had a short pregnancy, which ended in a miscarriage in spring 1541. Simply being the darling of her husband's eye of an achievement to most observers, but then Henry was by no means easy to, as the trail of dead wives, friends, courtiers, and clergy in his past could have testified. Catherine therefore deserves significant credit for carefully, intelligently, and tactfully navigating her new position as queen. Henry's constant fawning over her was, no doubt, encouraged by Catherine's efforts to lovingly conform herself to his will. The king had a pattern of responding with anger and even threats when his wives attempted to exercise political power, unless he himself deputized them to do so, as in the case of Catherine of Aragon's regency during Henry's campaign in France. Anne Boleyn had stoked resentment in Henry for her habit of being outspoken on political and religious matters. Even Jane Seymour, mother of the king's beloved son, was met with threats from Henry when she attempted to influence his policies toward those involved in the 1537 pilgrimage of. In contrast to most of her predecessors, as well as her successor as queen, Catherine Howard almost never interfered in policy of any sort or challenged what Henry viewed as his kingly prerogative. On the rare occasions she did attempt to exert influence over state matters, She did so in ways that were socially acceptable for women in Tudor England. Like other queens, Catherine sought promotions and honours for her family and household members, but she also interceded with Henry for imprisoned and condemned nobles. She begged Henry's permission to send warm clothing and comforts to the Countess of Salisbury, Lady Margaret Pole, whom Henry had imprisoned in the Tower largely because her son, Cardinal Reginald Pole, was carrying on a campaign abroad against Henry's religious reforms. In fact, Catherine's largest single household expenditure during her time as queen was what she spent on Margaret Pole's comfort. Catherine also interceded on behalf of Sir John Wallop, Sir Thomas Wyatt, and Wyatt's secretary, John Mason, who were imprisoned simply for their social proximity to the lately disgraced and executed Thomas Cromwell. Henry, softened by his wife's compassion, relented and granted pardons and release to all three men. Not only did Catherine play her royal role well by keeping Henry happy, but she also set out to be her most warm and charming self with those close to him, including his ex-wife Anne of Cleves. Now recognised as the king's beloved sister, Anne had begun to be regularly received at court. This was a somewhat bizarre and unique social arrangement for the Tudor age, and most observers would probably understand if Catherine had behaved coldly toward Anne. But rather than keeping her at arm's length, the new queen treated Henry's ex-wife with effusive goodwill. Catherine famously and gaily celebrated the new year of 1541 by drinking and dancing with Anne of Cleves and other members of the court. Long after Henry had retired from the festivities, she also presented Anne with one of the puppies Henry had given her as a year's gift. Catherine was keen to cultivate warm relationships with Henry's children as Elizabeth and Edward were still very young, just 7 and 4 years old respectively, and if they couldn't have a mother's care, they were at least eager for a kind stepmother, which Catherine proved herself perfectly willing to be. Lady Mary, however, proved a much tougher challenge. To begin with, the Queen's new stepdaughter was quite a few years older than her, highly educated, deeply pious, and rather serious. Catherine no doubt struck Mary as a silly and pleasure-loving juvenile, which perhaps, to a certain extent, she was. But what else, one might ask, could one reasonably expect from a 17 or 18-year-old girl, Catherine's background and upbringing? She had been taken from the maiden's chamber of the Duchess's house, and within mere months had been placed at the very pinnacle of honour, adoration, wealth, and luxury in English society. Such a Cinderella story might make any young woman want to revel in it all. The dancing and amusements, the beautiful clothes and jewels. No doubt, it all seemed shallow to Mary, who had perhaps travelled a tougher road than Catherine in some respects, forcing Mary to grow up. She was also, admittedly, far more dignified with seemingly more substance than the teenaged queen. But this probably doesn't fully explain Mary's seemingly intense dislike of her. Mary may have been projecting some of the resentment she felt for her father onto Catherine. Mary likely found it humiliating to be forced to reverence what seemed to her an artless young girl as her stepmother and queen, while Henry's first wife and her own beloved mother, one of the most admired royal women in Europe, had been left to die in pain and disgrace. She also probably resented that Henry had cast off Anne of Cleves, whom she admired and cared for, to marry Catherine. Mary's coolness and continued disregard for her new stepmother infuriated the Queen, and with an uncharacteristic display of spite and haughtiness, she removed 2 ladies from Lady Mary's service for the lack of respect they had shown. In spite of this clash, Catherine remained high in Henry's favour, but when her fall came, it was both sudden and violent. Historians have traditionally cited Catherine Howard's greatest as queen as mainly intimate. However, there's no truly firm evidence that Catherine was ever actually unfaithful to Henry during their marriage. One is tempted to see her greatest missteps as those she made with monarchs and Derham before she ever came to serve at court, for it was rumours of these premarital relationships that first led Henry to order an investigation into Catherine's past. Yet, if these were indeed her only crimes, they turned Catherine Howard's life and her marriage to Henry VIII into the very definition of a tragedy, to be destined for a terrible and ignominious end, even before one begins from the very out. Until spring 1541, Henry's health had actually begun to show promising improvement following his marriage. The years 1539 and 1540 had seen him gain a great deal of weight all at once, largely due to enforced physical inactivity on account of his constantly ulcerated leg. But he improved markedly during the second half of 1540, enough to become something of his own active self again during his extended honeymoon with Catherine. In December, he even began a doctor-supervised regime to reduce his weight. But in April 1541, the wound on the king's leg began to pain him once again, keeping him confined to his chambers for at a time. Henry continually sent messages and gifts to Catherine, but refused to see her throughout his illness. Presumably, he was anxious that his beautiful young wife might see him as an ailing and helpless old man. It may have been the boredom of life without Henry, or the worry that he might be tiring of her, which led Catherine into dangerous territory while seeking comfort and distraction. Some historians believe Catherine Howard's alleged affair with Thomas Culpeper began around this time. The full extent of their physical relationship remains unknown, as both of them later denied they had ever slept together. But they did secretly send gifts and letters to one another, and at least one witness revealed, under varying circumstances of interrogation, that Catherine and Culpeper had met secretly and in private on multiple occasions. Jane Boleyn, the widowed Lady Rochford, who was one of Catherine's principal ladies-in-waiting, revealed during questioning that she had many times served as a messenger between the Queen and Culpeper, and that she had even stood guard outside the door on multiple occasions during their secret meeting. One of the most telling pieces of evidence of Catherine's feelings for Culpeper is the letter she wrote to him in her own hand, perhaps during early summer 1540. This letter was found in Thomas Culpeper's room in November or December 1541, and while it doesn't confirm any infidelity on the Queen's part, it's highly suggestive of her romantic feelings for her. It's the only document written by Catherine Howard that has survived intact. Master Culpeper, it reads, "I heartily recommend me on praying you to send me word how that you. It was showed me that you were sick, the which thing troubled me very much. I never longed so much for a thing as I do to see and to speak with you, the which I trust shall be shortly now. It makes my heart die to think what fortune I have that I cannot be always in your company. My trust is always in you, praying that you will come when my Lady Rochford is here, for then I shall be best at leisure to be your commandment. I would that you were with me now that you might see what pain I take in writing. Yours as long life endures." Historians have traditionally viewed Catherine's appointment of staff to her household as another example of her major missteps as queen, but these are fairly understandable in context. When Catherine became queen, the usual stream of family members and friends were drawn to the court seat, some by invitation, but some most likely as the result of blackmail. Catherine was glad to promote the prosperity of her family members when she became queen. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, was higher in favour than ever, and the court seemed inordinately crowded with Howards. Her siblings all benefited from Catherine's elevation, including most notably her eldest brother Charles, who was made a member of the Privy Chamber, and her younger sister Isabel, who came to court to serve as lady-in-waiting. But among those recruited to the new queen's household were a few troublingly familiar faces from her past: Joan Bulmer and Frances Derham. Joan had once served the Dowager Duchess and had lived at Norfolk House with Catherine for several years. Joan wrote to Catherine soon after her impending marriage to the king was made public, and while the letter seems respectful enough, some scholars have suggested that a few lines might imply a vague threat. Joan said she chose to apply to Catherine because of the perfect honesty that Joan had always found in her, and which Joan had heard from others still remained. In 16th century English, the words honesty and chastity were often used interchangeably, and it's possible Joan was reminding Catherine of just how much she knew about her past. "I trust," Joan wrote, "that the Queen will not forget her." Catherine promptly installed Mistress Bulmer in her household as a lady-in-waiting. In a seemingly more risky move, considering their previous relationship, Catherine also gave a position to Francis Derham. He applied to Catherine using a letter of recommendation from the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, which is extremely interesting. Agnes Howard had known about Catherine's premarital relationship with Derham and had been furious and disapproving enough to separate them and banish him to Ireland. Why would the Duchess then take the enormous risk of recommending him for the Queen's service when it might not only endanger Catherine's reputation, but her own as well? This leads one to suppose that Derham might have blackmailed both the Duchess and Catherine in order to secure a position for himself. Whatever the case, Catherine obliged and gave Derham a position as gentleman usher. Strangely, on the same day that Henry ordered a mass of thanksgiving to be said in every church, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, delivered to Henry a letter detailing accusations against Catherine for premarital intimate impropriety. The informant was John Lascelles, a former client of Thomas Cromwell and an ardent reformer, anxious to see the religiously conservative Howards removed from power. John informed Cranmer that he had received troubling intelligence about Catherine from his sister, Mary Lascelles, who had served as a housemaid for the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk during Catherine's residence. John had reportedly encouraged his sister to the Queen for a place in her household on the strength of their previous acquaintance, and Mary had apparently declined, claiming disapprovingly that prior to her marriage, Catherine had been, quote, a light young woman, both in living and in conditions. Mary then revealed the Queen's previous relationships to John. Henry was utterly shocked. He ordered an investigation to be conducted into the rumours, but initially seemed to doubt that any corroborating evidence or testimony might be found. Still, he ordered his Queen confined to her chambers, without explanation, until the allegations were dismissed. Sadly, they never were, and as the investigation progressed, Catherine's freedoms and honours were increasingly curtailed. During his interrogation, Henry Manox readily admitted to his previous relationship with Catherine, but affirmed they hadn't slept together. Luckily for him, he was the only man accused of intimate former acquaintance with the Queen who was eventually released without charge. Francis Derham, however, wasn't so lucky. Francis admitted to his formerly romantic and intimate relationship with Catherine and insisted they had been pre-contracted, but he vehemently denied they had renewed their affair following his arrival at court. Under torture, Derham confessed he hadn't attempted to pursue Catherine again because she had already embarked on a relationship with Thomas Culpeper. Thomas was then promptly arrested for questioning as well. Culpeper also denied having slept with Catherine, but later admitted he had intended to do so, and that she had intended the same. When Thomas Cranmer came to question Catherine herself, she was in such a pitiable state, he wrote, such as I never saw in any creature. She alternated sharply between terror of what might happen to her and remorse for concealing her intimate experiences before her marriage to the king. She confirmed the testimony of Henry Manox, and to a certain extent, that of Francis Derham as well. However, she denied there had been any pre-contract between them or expectation of marriage. Many historians have wondered at this, for the existence of a pre-contract prior to her marriage to the king might have been grounds for an annulment. If her marriage to Henry had been declared invalid, then there would have been no grounds for adultery charges. In the case of a queen, adultery was considered treason, since it placed in doubt the legitimacy of potential heirs to the throne. Catherine didn't seem to understand that admitting to a pre-contract could have saved her life. In a later interrogation session, Catherine reportedly changed her testimony, alleging that Derham had forced himself upon her, for reasons that are still unclear. Perhaps she believed that by denying any willing participation, as well as the pre-contract, this might prevent the imposition of a death sentence. Despite the fact that two of her relationships predated her marriage, and both she and Culpeper denied the accusations of it, she was nonetheless condemned to death by act of attainder in February 1542. The evidence of Catherine's guilt was only circumstantial, such as the letters and gifts exchanged between her and Culpeper. Under interrogation, One of her ladies-in-waiting admitted she had seen the Queen look longingly at Culpeper, and another testified she hadn't seen Catherine in her bed on several nights. Lady Rochford couldn't confirm that Catherine and Culpeper had slept together, but claimed they had spent such a significant amount of private time alone together. While Lady Rochford stood guard that, she said, she could not think it otherwise. Sadly, Lady Rochford was found guilty of treason right alongside her unfortunate mistress. Francis Dereham and Thomas Culpeper were sentenced to die by hanging, drawing, and quartering, but Culpeper's sentence was ultimately commuted to beheading, presumably owing to his noble birth and Henry's former fondness for Catherine Howard went to her own execution with impressive bravery. On the night before her death, strangely, she didn't send for a confessor, but instead requested that the executioner's block be brought to her, so that she might rehearse the proper way to place herself upon it. This gives us a poignant picture of Catherine at the end, determined to bear her coming ordeal with calm, courage, grace, and dignity. The next morning, on February 13th, 1542, Catherine was led out onto the Tower Green. She faltered for a moment as she approached the block and had to be assisted to mount the scaffold. But when she faced the assembled crowd, she spoke clearly and steadily. Some sources claim Catherine said she wished she had died the wife of Culpeper, but most historians have dismissed this claim as apocryphal. Catherine's last words were actually much more conventional. She asserted she deserved death for her crimes against the king, exhorted the crowd to pray for him and obey him, begged that her disgrace not rebound unfairly on the members of her family who were innocent and ignorant of her wrongdoing, and affirmed her faith in God. This kind of final speech was highly typical of those condemned to execution, and showed that Catherine was anxious to protect those she knew she would leave behind, for the last words of condemned persons were reported to the king. Poor Lady Rochford, who had suffered what seemed to be a psychotic break during her incarceration, promptly followed her mistress to the executioner's block. Henry had actually pushed a bill through Parliament to allow insane persons for treason, just for the occasion. Much of the historiography on Catherine Howard has been called misogynistic in more recent works. Traditionally, she has been depicted as a silly, empty-headed, pleasure-loving, and wanton temptress, a teenaged femme fatale. Earlier biographers, even 20th century scholars, have used words like whore and good-time girl in academic print and discourse today. More than any other facet of her life, Catherine Howard's intimate life has been the central focus of most historians who have written about her. This is somewhat understandable, since it was the central focus of her downfall, and historical documents which tell us anything about her personal experience or personality are relatively rare. Recent scholarship has argued that this trend of focusing only on Catherine's intimate life has had the effect of obscuring almost everything else about her, and that her condemnation was an absurdly hypocritical expression of double standards. Looking past her supposed sins is necessary to see something more closely approximate the whole person. A girl who was impressionable, susceptible to flattery and adoration, who seems to have deeply revered and cared for Henry, but may have fallen away from him due to a lack of confidence in his love for her. A girl who was compassionate to those who were suffering, who loved animals, especially dogs, and who was happy to help family members become more prosperous. A girl who had perhaps made mistakes, but who, some historians argue, was repeatedly exploited by much older men. Whatever one's perspective, Catherine Howard met her end with a sense of personal responsibility and with a bravery that one cannot help but respect, especially in a girl no older than 19. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vinc, close to the final resting places of George and Anne Boleyn, her first cousins and fellow martyrs to King Henry's ego, rage, and ambition. Henry was reportedly devastated by Catherine's betrayal. He had firmly believed her to have been chaste before their marriage, which for him was problematic enough. But the fact that she had taken Francis Dereham into her queenly household and spent time alone with Thomas Culpeper, as well as writing to him and sending him gifts, was evidence enough for Henry of her unfaithfulness, however circumstantial. Perhaps the most humiliating thing for Henry was not just the appearance of being cuckolded, but what it implied. If his beautiful teenaged wife, whom he doted upon, had seen the need to look elsewhere for intimate fulfillment, it impugned Henry's manhood by suggesting he was too old and impotent to satisfy. This inference may well have contributed significantly to his decision to execute her rather than divorce her or annul the marriage. The suggestion of Henry's impotence had pierced his pride and ego, the most dangerous of wounds. This episode may have also facilitated the growth of Henry's attraction to Catherine Parr, who was more mature at 31, capable of more educated and intelligent discourse, and who promised a warm companionship with someone closer to his own age. In some ways, Henry's relationship with Catherine Parr calls to mind his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, for the king apparently found much to admire in his sixth wife that he had also admired in his first. Catherine, later known as Catherine Parr, the sixth and final queen consort of Henry VIII, was most likely born at her family's townhouse in Blackfriars, London. Her exact birth date is unknown, but it was probably in late summer or early autumn of 15. She was the eldest child of Sir Thomas Parr and Maud Green, who had two more children after Catherine's, William and Anne. Sir Thomas was knighted by Henry VIII in 1509 and was much favoured by him. He held several positions throughout his years of service at Henry's court, including comptroller to the king, while his wife, Maud, served as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon. The Parr family would have been classified as gentry rather than nobility. Like the Boleyns, the Parr family had risen in the world as a result of several generations of royal patronage and advantageous marriages. By the time of Catherine's birth, they were wealthy northern landowners and connected by marriage to some of the most prominent noble families in. The Parrs divided their time between their estate of Kendal at Westmoreland and their London house in Blackfriars, where they were readily accessible to the royal court. When Sir Thomas died in 1517, he left his widow and children with an ample estate, one that ensured Maud wouldn't have to remarry, which she never did. Instead, Maud poured her energy into raising and educating her children. Luckily for Catherine and her siblings, their mother was more progressive and better educated than most women of her background and station, and as a result, Catherine and her younger sister Anne received education as thorough and rigorous as their brother William. In addition to being trained in courtly etiquette, dance, and perhaps music as well, all three Parr siblings were instructed in history, French, Italian, Latin, and perhaps additional academic subjects as well. In fact, Maud Parr's household developed such a reputation for dedication to scholarship and learning that the parents of other noble and gentry families of her acquaintance often appealed to her to take in their children to finish their education. The Dowager Duchess of Norfolk may have been one of the foremost women in England, but her ward, Catherine Howard, received far less attention or nurture and a far inferior education than the children in Maud Parr's household. In short, Maud's home was a finishing school par excellence, and Catherine benefited enormously from her mother's efforts. This shouldn't suggest that Maud intended much more than a good marriage for her daughters. Like any Tudor matron, she was concerned above all with arranging the best possible marriages for her children. When Catherine was 17, Maud arranged her marriage to Sir Edward Berg, the 21-year-old son of Baron Berg. Earlier biographies have confused Catherine's first husband with his father, who was also named Edward. Thus it has traditionally been supposed that Catherine's first marriage was to a much older man, which isn't the case. Few specific details are known about Catherine Parr's life between 1529 and 1543, when she married Henry VIII, but these were, no doubt, formative years for Catherine in an intellectual and spiritual sense. She was first married to Sir Edward Berg in 1529, a marriage that became much more contented when, in 1531, the couple moved away from Edward's family home and Catherine's reportedly abusive father-in-law. Sadly, Sir Edward died in 1533 following a short. Only a year later, the widowed Catherine, who was still a young woman at 21, married John Neville, 3rd Baron Latimer, a man more than twice her age. She may have met him while visiting their mutual relative, Catherine Neville, Dowager Duchess of Strickland. Catherine's mother Maud had died by this time, and so her second marriage may have been largely by her own choice. It was certainly a prestigious marriage. Catherine became only the second member of her family to marry into the English peerage, and there's evidence to suggest they cared for one another and enjoyed a happy union, though their marriage produced no children. Catherine was a loving stepmother to Lord Latimer's 2 children, John and Margaret, and after his death, the Baron entrusted the care of his daughter and the management of her finances until she married, to his widow, Catherine. Until her own death, several years later, Catherine kept among her personal and sentimental possessions a New Testament, which had once belonged to her second husband, inscribed with his name. Lord and Lady Latimer certainly faced challenges together during the 1537 pilgrimage. The northern uprising against the abolition of the monastery and other religious reforms was greeted with sympathy and support from some nobles, and with horror and reluctant acquiescence by others. With literally tens of thousands risen in rebellion, the northern English aristocracy and gentry were forced to contend with their discontented neighbours on their very own doorstep. Some made concessions to the rebels out of fear of their numbers, for no single nobleman could call upon sufficient force to resist one of the largest potential armies ever to be. Lord Latimer had thoroughly disapproved of the king's divorce from his first wife, his marriage to Anne Boleyn, and presumably the reforms that had followed. It's unclear just how much the rebels had to twist Lord Latimer's arm to persuade him to join their cause, but some sources claim he quite publicly embraced it. The true commitment of any noble household to the cause, however, was more likely to be manifest in its mistress. The ladies of northern aristocratic households who opposed religious reform showed their support by providing resources, sympathy, and verbal encouragement to the rebels, presumably at the sanction of their husbands. But though her husband seemed to support the rebellion, even if he did so under duress, there's no evidence that Catherine Parr did. Catherine's lack of agreement and cooperation with the rebels may be inferred by the fact that she and her stepchildren were held prisoner in their own home by the rebels, perhaps to secure Lord Latimer's Catherine's lack of response to the Pilgrimage of Grace might signal that she had already formed, or perhaps was beginning to form, her Protestant reformist. When the rebellion ended, Lord and Lady Latimer began to spend more time near London and Henry's court, presumably to remain close enough to demonstrate their loyalty and reassure the king that they had only collaborated with the northern rebels under duress. Catherine formed a warm and friendly relationship with Lady Mary during this period. Additionally, Catherine's brother William and their sister Anne were both high in favour at court. Catherine's relationships with these allies no doubt helped to clear Lord and Lady Latimer of any hint of collaboration or treason with the rebels. It was in London in 1542 that Catherine first met Sir Thomas Seymour, brother of Queen Jane Seymour. It was generally known at that time that Lord Latimer was ill health and likely to die soon, and the knowledge that Catherine was soon to be a very rich widow may have sharpened. Thomas was described by contemporaries as very handsome and charming, but also highly ambitious and often unscrupulous in pursuing his aims. How much he truly cared for Catherine is unclear, but Catherine clearly fell for him. As one of her surviving letters to Seymour testified, she claimed she had fallen in love with him and wanted to marry him, even before the king offered her marriage, and Henry most likely knew he had competition for Lady Latimer's hand, as he seemingly without warning offered Sir Thomas Seymour a handsome promotion and sent him to serve abroad in the Netherlands once Lord Latimer had died and Catherine had emerged from her mourning. Less than 6 months after Lord Latimer's death, Henry and Catherine were married in the Queen's closet at Hampton Court Palace on July 12, 1543. Why did she accept his proposal? Was she afraid of what it might mean, issues the king? This seems a likely consideration in view of Henry's character and reputation. Some of her biographers believe she accepted Henry's proposal as part of a religious mission to facilitate the advance of reform in England by being a subtle but committed advocate for Protestant values. The warm relationship she had developed with Lady Mary in the previous few years may have played a role as well. Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, had stood as Catherine Parr's godmother, and it was for Henry's first queen that Sir Thomas and Maud Parr had named their daughter. Catherine may have been motivated by a sense of duty to the young woman she had befriended, to the girl's departed mother, and perhaps to Henry's younger children, who were no less in need of a loving mother figure. Catherine adapted to her new position as queen consort quickly and well. She and Henry embarked on a honeymoon progress, which lasted for most of the latter half of the. Henry took pride not only in his new wife's virtue and intelligence, he also admired her beauty. There are at least 3 portraits that have been confirmed to correctly depict Catherine Parr. The Melton Constable or Hastings portrait, a full-length portrait attributed to Tudor court painter Master John, and a half-length portrait currently residing in the National Portrait Gallery in London. All 3 depict a tall, stately, slender, and attractive woman in her 30s with auburn red hair, expressive brown eyes, pale skin, and delicate features. Henry and Catherine seemed to quickly develop an easy intimacy and companionable relationship. They were much closer in age than Henry had been with his previous 3 wives, and were fairly evenly matched in education, intelligence, and rhetoric. Henry's faith in Catherine was such that he appointed her to serve as regent during his absence in 1540, when he led yet another military campaign in France, apparently another attempt to recapture some of the glory of his. It was an affair of absurd cost in men and resources, with virtually no tangible reward, short-term or otherwise, but Catherine offered Henry her full support and encouragement in his military endeavours, ably and intelligently managed affairs of state as regent, and faithfully kept Henry informed of all developments while he remained in France. She greeted the king's return as that of a conquering hero, and he in turn commended her efforts and stewardship on his behalf during his absence. In a move that shows real trust, Henry didn't seek to bar Catherine from his chambers during his periodic bouts of illness, largely centering around his old leg wound. The Queen willingly and ably nursed Henry, just as she had nursed Lord Latimer through his final illness. It seemed Catherine could rise no higher in her husband's favour, and this may have given her the confidence to pursue her goals to influence reform more openly. Her attempts to do so eventually placed Queen Catherine in the same danger into which both Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard before her had fallen. Like all of her predecessors, Catherine Parr at first exercised power rather minimally. She elevated her family members by appointing them to positions in her household, including her siblings and stepchildren. Her sister Anne, Lady Herbert, who had served both Anne of Cleves and Catherine Howard, was made principal lady-in-waiting, and her brother William was made Earl of Essex. But more significantly, Catherine also made subtle efforts to promote the cause of Protestantism by appointing reformers to key positions, including her personal chaplain and the tutors assigned to teach Lady Elizabeth and Prince Edward. Henry, who was as well educated as his new queen, was impressed by her learning and intellectual sophistication and readily sought her advice on his children's education. But he was, at that point in time, probably unaware of how deeply committed Catherine was to the cause of religious reform. Henry knew that Catherine was pious and that she was no Catholic sympathizer, but it wouldn't become clear to him until 1546 how strongly his wife favoured the reformist cause. But while Henry was, in a doctrinal sense, more religiously conservative than his wife, his main problem may have been with her increasing habit of being outspoken and of challenging him, especially on religious matters and on policy. In 1544, Catherine anonymously published an English translation of Bishop John Fisher's Latin text, Psalms and Prayers. The following year, she published prayers and meditations under her own name, and her English translation sold remarkably well. Henry appreciated and admired Catherine's learning and public virtue, and seemed to find her conversation stimulating for the most part, but her growing popularity may have irked him, especially as she grew bolder in her arguments and challenges on religious matters. Henry might even have felt some jealousy upon receiving as a New Year's gift in 1546 a Latin translation of his wife's enormously popular book from his daughter, who may have seemed, to Henry, to admire her stepmother more than she did her father. Catherine's increasingly bold speech eventually produced open grumbling from him that he should be lectured and condescended to by his wife on matters that were, according to his own policy, within his power alone. When religious conservatives like Bishop of Winchester Stephen Gardiner and Lord Chancellor and Earl of Southampton Thomas Wriothesley approached Henry with allegations of the Queen's supposedly heretical leanings, which appeared far more extreme than the Act of 6 Articles, the king seemed fairly well disposed to entertain their suspicions. He even permitted Wriothesley to issue a warrant for her arrest and interrogation. Luckily for Catherine, the warrant was never served. The document was first waylaid by means of an unknown servant and delivered directly into Catherine's. Panicked, she collapsed into weeping and resolved to try as hard as possible to at least appear to conform to Henry's will. When he confronted her about her timidity in challenging him and her refusal to allow herself to be instructed by ancient authorities, namely himself, Catherine eloquently protested that she had only argued with Henry in order to benefit from his superior wisdom, as well as to distract him from the painful trials of his recurring illness, which had been continually plaguing him of late. She then affirmed that her duty and her place was to honour and respect Henry's authority. Interestingly, these claims were probably not just lip service from Catherine, or a clever ploy to save her skin. Catherine may have been considered by some to be a radical in her own time for her Protestant views, but her perspective on the role of women was quite conventional for the Tudor period. This was made clear in the Queen's religious treatise, published after Henry's death in 1547, Lamentations of a Sinner, which, though it strongly espoused reformist doctrinal views, was actually quite traditional in its attitudes to women's roles. Catherine believed that women should be taught to read and understand the scriptures, but simultaneously exhorted them to remain silent and obedient to their husbands in all things. Henry was generous to his wife in his will, bequeathing to her a lavish annual income of £7,000, as well as the right to retain the royal jewels during her lifetime. Following Henry's death and Catherine's prompt retirement from court, Thomas Seymour, who had recently been made first Baron Sudeley, re-entered Catherine's life almost immediately. Before she was even out of mourning for Henry, the two were quietly married sometime in May 1547. Thomas's brother, Edward, who had been made Lord Protector during the new King Edward VI's minority, was furious with both his brother and the Dowager Queen. Their hasty marriage could have made it difficult to judge the paternity of any child Catherine might have within 9 months of Henry's death, which had only just occurred at the end of January. Moreover, Thomas Seymour's act of marrying the Dowager Queen in secret and without the permission of the Regency Council made them suspect and distrust his ambitions. It also alienated Lady Mary, who considered the secrecy and hastiness of their marriage to be both indecent and an affront to her father's memory, and a rift developed between Catherine and Mary which was never healed. Such a risky approach to marriage seems somewhat out of character for Catherine, but perhaps at 35, having finally made what she believed to be a true love match, she decided to waste no more time, throw caution to the wind, and with the man she wanted. The year immediately following her 4th marriage was probably one of the happiest of Catherine Parr's life. She and her husband established residence at his seat of Sudeley Castle in Gloucester. She responded to an appeal from her former stepdaughter, Lady Elizabeth, with an invitation to come and live with her and Seymour, where she could continue to supervise Elizabeth's education. Naturally, Catherine's intellectual reputation preceded her, and other noble families were soon applying to the Dowager Queen to take in other daughters of the aristocracy who needed a respectable place to complete their education. Most notable among them was Lady Jane Grey, granddaughter of Henry's sister, Mary Tudor, and Elizabeth's first cousin. Just as her mother had once been, Catherine was now a respected woman of learning and culture, sought after and entrusted with the care and education of the children of illustrious families. Early in the following year of 1548, Catherine discovered she was pregnant, perhaps for the first time in her life, and at last her happiness seemed complete. Sadly, her calm contentment would be shattered several months later when, more than halfway through her pregnancy, she discovered that her husband had been actively pursuing an illicit relationship with her own stepdaughter, Elizabeth. It later came to light that Thomas Seymour had been regularly visiting Elizabeth's chamber in the early mornings in a state of nighttime undress and attempting to engage in inappropriate and vaguely intimate horseplay with her. The extent to which Catherine was initially aware of the behaviour or understood the extent of it is unclear. Some sources allege that Catherine participated in some of Seymour's acts, but it's hard to picture the pregnant Dowager Queen as complicit in such impropriety. By the summer of 1548, she was resolved of all doubts when she stumbled upon Thomas and Elizabeth, quote, in an embrace. Catherine promptly sent Elizabeth away, ostensibly, it seems, to protect her stepdaughter from her husband, but perhaps also to save her marriage, the apparent fragility of which appears to have hurt Catherine. When she went into labour in late August, her first experience of childbirth proved very difficult and taxing. One contemporary source claimed that in the pain and stress of the birth, Catherine vented her rage and despair at her husband's betrayal, accusations which she seemed not to recall after her daughter and only child, Mary, was born. Catherine lived less than a week after her daughter's arrival. The infant Mary Seymour, who was named for the Dowager Queen's beloved stepdaughter, lost her mother when she was only 6. On September 5, 1548, Catherine Parr died of puerperal fever, which was the fairly common result of unhygienic conditions during childbirth. She was buried on her husband's estate at Sudeley Castle. When Thomas Seymour was executed for treason less than a year after his wife's death, the infant Mary Seymour was sent to live with Catherine's friend and fellow reformer, Catherine Brandon née Willoughby, the Duchess of Suffolk. Most historians don't believe that Mary Seymour survived her early childhood and suggest she most likely died by the age of 2. Catherine Parr has traditionally been credited with a broad and impressive legacy. It had been partly her influence that had led Henry to reinstate his daughters the succession. Her contributions to the growth of Protestantism in England have traditionally been celebrated by reformers who continued to promote their cause after her death. She was one of the most educated and respected women of her age and class, an impressive achievement for a woman whose family had only been knighted gentry for 3 generations. But perhaps her most notable legacy can be seen in the lives and policies of Edward VI, and more particularly Elizabeth I, whose education, ideology, religion, and vision for England's future had been shaped more by Henry's 6th wife than perhaps by any other person. Catherine Parr represented the culmination of Henry VIII's matrimonial, a woman who combined intelligence with devotion, scholarship with pragmatism, and reform with respect for truth. In her, Henry found not just a wife, but a true partner who could match his intellect while managing his volatile temperament. Her story reminds us that even in the shadows of more famous queens, there lived women of remarkable substance who shaped the course of English history through their quiet strength, scholarly pursuits, and unwavering faith. Catherine Parr proved that survival in Henry's court required not just beauty or compliance, but wisdom, courage, and an understanding of when to speak and when to remain silent. As we close this first chapter of our journey through England's queens, we see how these 3 remarkable women, Anne of Cleves with her diplomatic grace, Catherine Howard with her tragic youth, and Catherine Parr with her scholarly devotion, each navigated the treacherous waters of Tudor court life in their own unique ways. Each left her mark on history, not just as Henry's wives, but as individuals who faced extraordinary circumstances with varying degrees of success, teaching us about resilience, intelligence, and the complex nature of power in the 16th century. Sleep peacefully, dear listener, and let these gentle tales of courage and complexity carry you into restful dreams. Tomorrow, we shall continue our journey through the corridors of royal history, but for now, let the soft echoes of Tudor England lull you into tranquil slumber.